Hello, everybody, and welcome to a new episode of Occulted. We have had a lot of esoteric activity in the last few weeks, so we are going to dive into all of the chaos that has been going on and sort of use what's happened in the last 2 weeks to look into what the real root of spiritual disorder is in our world and the group or groups that are behind it and how we can identify them. And I wouldn't say this is a new conversation. This is really the root conversation that everybody just ends up having or coming down to over time. And I think it's good to reiterate this, especially in times of intense chaos, where it seems like everybody's angry at one another. There's incredible amounts of division. It's good to come back around to a real center point and discuss, okay, well, what and who is really causing all of this? And how can we recognize it? And what are some solutions? So this will probably be more than one video, but this video today is really to figure out, okay, well, what is the spiritual reality behind what is going on, and specifically in the world, in the material world, who is behind the chaos and how can we recognize them, okay? So if we're just going to get down to brass tacks, which I think is necessary, the people behind the Kirk assassination and many of the assassinations that we've seen over the past hundreds of years is not a nation. It's not a nation state. It's not a country, okay? There is a deep state. There is a consortium of people, probably not more than 100, that essentially have consolidated all worldly power and resources under themselves, and they pull the strings. And they work through nations. They work through the religions. They work through these different ethnicities and groups. They want race wars. They want division. They want this contention between the left and the right. They are behind the radicalization, and why they are is because they operate through chaos. So there is a dark contingency in this world that is organized. It's not just like a spiritual energy that moves into people and forces them to do things like that, although that is part of it, and we'll talk about that. There are occult orders. There's a society that's basically around creating chaos in the world and consolidating power through chaos and essentially black magic. This is an organized group of people that do this. And these are the individuals that are ultimately responsible for certain assassinations. This is part of their occult rite. Death, public humiliation through death, shedding blood in public, creating this martyrdom in society is part of how they operate. It's a magical rite, especially the production of chaos, which is exactly what we're seeing with the Kirk assassination. We're seeing the creation of mass chaos. Immediately, there's one, decoy or patsy that comes forward and says, I did it, and then another one, and then there's a shooter on the roof, and then there's another one on the other roof, and it is sheer chaos. And you could say that maybe this is the FBI's or law enforcement's, inability to solve this crime, or you could say that this is them breaking, or we could recognize that creating chaos and destabilizing the population is the point. The point is that this is a chaos ritual, which is part of black magic. And there are people and organized societies that operate in black magic in these very dark, events. Now, this doesn't mean that, when you do have an assassination, that it's automatically theater or theatrics. Evil does exist and people do get actually killed, and the blood being spilled in that way is very important. The opening of the portal of death is very important in an occult rite. So when people say, oh, it's fake or whatever, I wasn't there. I'm not going to say, ultimately what is going on. I can just tell you without a shadow of a doubt that killing people publicly is part of occult rites. So in order for this to be theatrical in its way, in order to have theatrical components, that's a ritual. So yes, you can have a public death ritual that occurs, and somebody can actually die, and that doesn't make it any less of a way in which energy is being created to harness, especially with 2 eclipses that happen back to back in this scenario. So the main thing here is that there is a dark occult group that does not identify with any country. They're not saying, I am, Israel, or I am China, or I am this. They do not identify with any countries. The countries on the map are pawns. The world is a chessboard, and we are pawns, and they are playing a game. This is not conspiratorial. I think that it is very nice to think that this doesn't exist. It's very nice to think that psychopathy or organized psychopathy doesn't exist, but that is very naive. That is very naive. And until we can grow up and understand that this does exist, we will continue to decline in society as a culture. Because why culture often declines is we are unable to identify and deal with spiritual evil. We're unable to identify and deal with evil and immorality, because part of it is that we're not at that level within ourselves, but we have to identify this to deal with it. So this group does not identify as any nation. They use nations periodically to foment hatred, to foment drama, to foment war, to keep the war machine going, to keep division going, to keep chaos going, to keep humanity in fear and survivalism. So and by the way, on a completely mundane level, let's talk about Israel, because this is always coming up again and again. Ultimately, the people who are behind, in my opinion, the assassination and many of the other assassinations, it's not a nation, it is this group that operates through assassination and all sorts of other disgusting things. If Israel is doing things and has an issue with lobbying and doing all these corrupt things, which I believe there are issues there, then that should be worked upon on a geopolitical level, and that should be solved. There should be no nations that are in these kinds of weird controlling relationships with one another, period. America should be a sovereign country, and we should do everything we can to return to that. That is the original vision of the country, right? So these are geopolitical issues, but we have to go beyond that to a highly organized dark occult group that operates through the intelligence agencies and things beyond, dark back rooms, honestly. So they're also not identified with any ethnicity or religion. And really, there is a coalescing of different religions and ethnicities and things like that for this to even work. So why I'm saying this is I keep repeatedly seeing, oh, it's a transgender person. Oh, it's Israel. Oh, it's a MAGA person. It's like, okay, we have healing to do in the world and in this country. With our foreign relationships, okay, things need to be pointed out and discussed. No complaints there. We do have an issue with radicalized factions. That's not an issue. But if we're only sticking to the most material explanation, we're never actually going to solve the problem. And again, identifying bad actors, identifying imbalances can be dealt with. But we have to get to the root. We have to actually discuss it on an occult and spiritual level, because ultimately all of this chaos and all of these dark events that take place, they're harvesting the energy from that. And they're able to make changes in policy and changes around the world through the fear and the confusion and the division that they create. So the spiritual aspect must be discussed. So ultimately, this one shadowy occult group, this secret society, if you will, they will use people's greed, their shadow, their lusts, their urges against them to control the world. So they'll place different leaders to rule different countries. They'll compromise people. This is why the blackmail conversation has been so, important in the last 10 years, that everybody has a blackmail file on them in order to even get in public office. It's not a nation that's doing that. It is a much higher entity. And if you just say take out a nation, like you say, oh, well, it's this nation that's responsible for it. Another nation will come up in 6 months or a few weeks as the next person, like Orwell's, now we're fighting Europa, now we're fighting this, now we're fighting that. So we have to get past this Orwellian blaming of a material enemy, another nation, an ethnicity, a race, for a problem that's actually significantly deeper, which is a spiritual issue and also occult orders that operate and institutionalize evil in the world. Okay? They operate through that in an organized way. And this has been going on for really thousands of years. This is how, the dark side has always worked, through manipulation, through control. But because we're becoming more globalized and our technology is increasing, we're just facing this incredibly challenging period where, with the increase in technology, there's actually an opportunity for this group to enforce very real controls, like the space fence, or like the Golden Dome or whatever. Everyone thinks, oh my gosh, we need this for missile defense. It's like, yeah, but that's also a massive surveillance grid and a weapon that can be pointed at you, at people, right? So we're at this overdevelopment of technology. We're at a hyper development of technology. We're overdeveloping in that regard. It's becoming high surveillance. A lot of things with AI and technology are directly immoral. They're directly against our freedoms, but we don't really know what to do with them because we don't really necessarily understand our freedoms to begin with. And so we're at this real big tussle with very dark forces in the world that work through certain activities like assassination, like war, like division, all of this political division going on. People have been so radicalized in the last 10 years, it's hard to even fathom it. And again, part of that also is to do with the algorithm and technology and things like this. It's amplifying what is already within us, our wounds. We have to be very aware of that. But really, you could probably, and people say, well, how can there be a small group of people really controlling the world? And it's like, even if you look at in a mundane sense at the world leaders, you can probably fit every single world leader in one building, right? And they're responsible for the legislation of their country, more or less. So it is possible, especially when you think about how centralized resources are, how centralized everything that we operate in, it's becoming more centralized. So this is how we have to see it. So if they can't be tracked by their religion, we can't say, oh, it's this religious group or it's that religious group. We can't say, oh, it is this ethnicity. This ethnicity is responsible for all of the evil in this world. You can't say this nation is responsible for all of the evil in this world. It's not precise enough, and it's not accurate enough, and it's not acknowledging the reality that everyone is an individual. So the moment you have this monolithic view of a nation or a religion or an ethnicity, you're immediately incorrect, because it does not acknowledge the individual, which is our spiritual purpose at this point in our existence. Is everybody must be seen as an individual and treated as such. Anything else is really barbaric at this point. So what is the most distinguishing feature of this dark group, this shadowy dark group that everybody seems to mention, but nobody can really identify? What is the identifying feature? The identifying feature actually is their occultism. They practice a very specific kind of occult magic. Okay, they practice black magic. But this black magic is not like the magic of, say, John Dee. Or we think about black magicians and we think about, you know, some person in a heavy leather trench in like a Crowley book or something. That is an antiquated view of spirituality for modern times. That's an antiquated view of black magic. This kind of spirituality that this order that is seeking control in the world practices is a black magic that is rooted in a scientific level understanding of the spiritual world and of the demonic plane. They have a scientific level understanding of the occult and the spiritual world, particularly of the lower astral plane and the demonic world. Not so much a good understanding of the heavenly worlds and angels and Christ and the higher level of spirituality, but they have a very, very nuanced and granular knowledge of the lower aspects of the spiritual world. So it wouldn't even be precise enough to call it Kabbalah or, you know, kind of this Roman Greek paganism. It's not enough to just call it paganism, because where they are now is actually the culmination of paganism into this sort of dark, occult, scientific view of the lower spiritual world. So they've taken whatever they were doing in, say, earlier periods in the sense of black magic practice, and they're now incorporating things like technology. They're now incorporating science. They're now incorporating a much deeper knowledge of these things now that science and technology exist. And so people keep talking about black magic and casting spells, and they talk about it like we're in the 1750s, right? Because it doesn't occur to people that the height of black magic in our day is actually going to be technology, because technology allows this relationship between people and golems, or people and electromagnetic devices, that allows spiritual entities to enter them. But if you only have, say, a religious knowledge of spirituality, a dogmatic religious knowledge of spirituality, then you're unprepared to really have that conversation. If they have this scientific level of knowledge about the spiritual world, yet with serious blind spots, then we must develop a scientific knowledge of the spiritual world. This is where we are. So technologies to this group that I'm speaking about, this small group that runs the world, the small group that does the assassinations at the right times, creates these dark rituals out of them and stuff. They are black magicians, and you can tell their particular signature because of their technology. They use technology, and they're also black magicians. So if they're doing anything to produce chaos, that's their signature. War, assassination, different political dramas that go on over and over again that make the ancestral wounds of different races and different cultures flare up against one another instead of healing and moving towards a more holistic worldview. All of that division, all of that death, it is death and chaos that they worship. And that is what they foment all the time. That's part of their religion. Yes, it is in every single human being. Yes, we need to heal, but we also need to understand that having our wounds scraped open all the time and hating each other and disliking each other and pointing the finger at each other is what feeds that. It is what feeds the demonic plane, and it is what feeds this order, and that is why they do that. And at their top level of, you could say, initiation, they worship technology and the entities that come through the electromagnetic and nuclear level of, I would say, force. The electric, magnetic, and nuclear forces, the transformations that come through these things, they worship that. It's externalism. It is a materialist, externalist approach to spirituality that allows demonic entities to manifest very clearly through the use of electricity, magnetism, devices, even nuclear, you could say, transactions. That's how they operate. And the reason why they do is because the path of Christ involves internal transformation. It involves personal sacrifice. It sometimes involves humiliation. It involves humbling yourself. It involves ultimately a deeply inward process. And so when people don't want to experience that ego death, they don't want to stand before the Christ and bow, right? They ultimately get funneled into these externalist, materialist forms of pseudo-spiritual relationship with external things that manifest more materially, which are things from the demonic plane, ultimately. So we know them through chaos. We know them through death. They worship death. They worship killing. They worship blood hitting the soil, especially through humiliating assassinations. Public assassinations is a big one for them. And they work through technology in modern times. Again, throw away your ideas of black magic from the 1700s, the 1600s, the 1800s. Yes, the foundation will be there. The ultimate mysteries are present, but the actual methods have modernized. And this is what we're not understanding as a culture. We're not understanding that dark occultism has now moved into technology, and that is the discussion we need to have essentially before it's too late. All right. So technology allows certain esoteric forces, spiritual entities, especially demonic ones, to begin to centralize and triangulate with your energy and then a device, right? And then that allows possession to occur. So possession is something that's working its way externally from the outside in. Real spiritual evolution through Christ is inside out. It's radiance, like the sun. So this is what we must understand. And it's not, and we have a predisposition to this, I want to be clear as well, is that we have a predisposition towards wanting everything to be external and material. We want things to be logical. We want things to be tangible. It's kind of a weak spot. And so people get very caught up in thinking that their chat bot is their spirit guide, or thinking that, you know, these technologies are spiritual things, neutral things, when in fact they're not. So I talked about that in my episode of Occulted from, I think, a few weeks ago. It's called Possessed Machines. And so if you want more on the technology aspect of the dark occult and possession and the nature of machines here, please go back and watch that episode. So from the place of, you could say, this dark occult order, when they're introducing these technologies to the world, whether it be AI, whether it be this mass surveillance grid, or, even something like the Golden Dome, or space travel to the moon or Mars, we're entering into that process from a place of extreme materialism and ignorance, and we think this is for science. We think this is for survival. That's what we think these things are. We look at the, advanced technology piece. Again, why is Lockheed Martin, by the way, suddenly announcing they're going to be releasing something right after the Kirk assassination, right between two solar eclipses? This is the connection between technology and occultism that we need to start getting on, right? So we're looking into the world and we're looking at, Artemis, or going to the moon and like having a nuclear reactor on the moon. And we're like, this is for survival. This is for research. This is for science. We have to colonize Mars for our survival, for science, for exploration. That is not what it is for the people who are pushing this. Going to Mars is a religious thing for the people that push that. Going to the moon, having a nuclear reactor on it, is a temple. It is a spiritual thing, because certain things, super technologies, massive amounts of electricity and magnetism and nuclear transformations, bring about spiritual entities. So we're engaging with these concepts from a place of pure materialist ignorance. And they're bringing these things in from a place of dark occultism. And we're being told, oh, we need these things. We need the Golden Dome, right? We need all this surveillance from Peter Thiel or Bill Gates or whatever tech bro is battling it out to be the last one standing. We need these things. This country will get it or that country will get it, but we're going to destroy ourselves and have no dignity left and no humanity left. But at least we won the AI race. It's like, it's getting really wacky. And we have to understand, again, say it one more time. Space, so NASA, the moon, Mars. Space has always been a spiritual domain. It is literally the heavens. Planetary spheres have always been the realms of the angels and the barriers into the spiritual world. Now we're looking at space as being just a physical thing to mine, to go there for research. We have lost the spiritual reality to space. Okay, but these groups, which, by the way, why is every person that goes to space a Freemason? Why is JPL named after Jack Parsons, who was incredibly into explosions? We understand that there's already an incredible amount of dark occultism connected to space. And we're going to see that in a big way in the next few years, as they have to do certain things in space to complete their overall dark occult rites. We think that all of these technologies coming in are to better ourselves, to have information at our fingertips, to make things easier, or to protect us in the case of some of the weaponry and high surveillance stuff. That's what we think. That's what we're told. Because we're not recognizing that this is an occult agenda. There is an occultism to AI. There's an occultism to something like the Golden Dome. This is how we have to view it. If we view it from a materialist lens, we're making ourselves very vulnerable. Okay, so how do we overcome this? How do we overcome? I mean, it's incredibly intimidating because, you know, we want to blame the people that we hate. We want to blame a country. We want to blame a religion, an ethnicity, and then just say there. But that won't actually work because this group is beyond those things and in fact uses those things. So if you really want to get to the bottom of it, you have to realize their real kind of occultism that they use and track it that way, and don't participate in it really. Don't allow them to do that anymore, ultimately. But if we want to overcome this, we have to have an approach that fundamentally addresses the different levels of, you could say, how this group operates. So we have to address it from the spiritual level, which means we have to become very, very educated in occult science and spiritual science, because then we can see exactly what's going on a spiritual level and not participate. We get to see the patterns. We understand the connection between different spiritual entities and technology. We understand the purpose of chaos. Chaos is black magic, right? A key aspect of black magic. Chaos is a key. And we also just have to evolve our own knowledge of the spiritual world in general, which objectively exists for our own development. But it will also, as a default, prepare us to confront and actually deal with the spiritual evil in the world, which cannot be directly and singularly confronted through like a dogmatic faith. You have to be able to, on a scientific, granular level, describe the spiritual world and the entities in it, because that's what the dark occultists can absolutely do. Even if they have a huge blind spot when it comes to Christ, when it comes to spiritual initiation, when it comes to certain levels of the heavens, they don't have that. But when it comes to what they do with the spiritual world, it is very precise. It is at a scientific, nuanced level. And 99.9% of the population is not there with the spiritual world. We don't even believe, a lot of people don't even believe the spiritual world exists, let alone being able to describe it in a nuanced, precise way. This is where mystics come in, who deal with this stuff every single day. There has to be some position where mystics are able to speak. Okay? Secondly, we have to have a geopolitical, mundane solution as well. So we can't expect change if we exclude one of these. We will see no change in the world if we say, oh, this is just a transgender person, case closed. Let's break up transgender people in gangs or whatever is going on. It won't stop if you crack down on transgenderism. Okay, the assassinations won't stop. We are probably coming into a period from now until January of more global upheaval because of what we'll talk about in our next episode of Occulted. So you're not gonna prevent any more destruction by just saying, oh, this is a transgender person, or oh, this is Israel, or oh, this is a certain, ethnicity, or whatever it is. That will not stop it because it is beyond that. These things are being used, these different subcultures are being used. Whether we agree with them or we don't agree with them, whether we think there's a sickness there or not, they are being used like pawns in order to produce chaos, which they feed on. So we have to acknowledge that it won't be solved by only looking at the most material level of something. Okay. It's also not going to be solved if you don't properly deal with the geopolitical problems that we have. So the reason why we do point fingers at certain nations or certain groups is because there are legitimate issues with our relationships with them. We have to heal that, right? So we do have to take responsibility in that way for whatever imbalances there are. So let's go a little bit deeper into spiritual escapism, which does not help our cause, and material escapism, which also does not help our cause. So I see a lot of people who look at the mess that we are in society and feel completely overwhelmed, often sensitive people, often spiritual people, and they just think, well, I can't personally do anything, or I don't know what to do. I feel overwhelmed. So I'm just going to sit back and meditate and remove myself from this. Evil has always existed, and I'm just going to, watch from my recliner. I'm just going to watch Armageddon from my recliner. But this is spiritual bypassing. This is a kind of removing oneself and a disembodying oneself, not necessarily from their physical body, but from the collective social body. There's different kinds of spiritual bypassing that can take place. And in our time, in 2025, in our epoch, we are supposed to create a society that is in the image of God. We have received the man that is in the image of God, who was Jesus, who bore the Christ. And now we must create a culture and a society that represents divine law. So we have to have our institutions and our government structure that represents divine law and create a container for growth and freedom, which means the confrontation of evil. So we are tasked, every human being at this point in the Earth's development is tasked to develop a culture, a society based in freedom, because freedom allows spiritual growth. This is the task of every nation. So it's not good enough for anyone to just sit back and say, well, I'm going to do my own personal work and just ignore the society, ignore the culture, while also going and getting a Starbucks, or also enjoying the roads and enjoying the society we live in. Nobody is completely divorced from that. We pay taxes, we participate in this culture together. We've gotten it to a certain point, and we must maintain freedom and use the governance that we have to continue that and get that to an even higher level. But we are being challenged right now. So there are some deep lessons and initiations that we are going through where we have to create a culture that is built around freedom and that has legislation, laws, and covenants and documents that protect freedom. That is our task. If we lose that, we go back into a chaotic situation or some kind of, regression. And the technology now is so advanced that you can't, go farm by yourself or have some kind of agrarian thing by yourself now, because the technology has been built up in such a way that there's nowhere to hide. There's no way to really develop in that way anymore at this point in human development. So we have to use the structure that we have in order to continue to be free and ensure our freedoms. That's the point. So the task the real task is to be able to establish that. And then in the next epoch that we move into, which is called the sixth epoch in the anthroposophical system, then you have more of a cohesive union of people around objective moral principles. But right now we're fighting to establish the foundation for that, the laws, the culture. We're fighting for that. And that involves the mystery of evil, facing the mystery of evil in its most extreme degree, which is what we are tasked to do. All right, so what evil wants to do is it wants to create a high surveillance society where you have no freedom. What evil does is it removes your freedom. It creates an environment where you cannot individuate. You cannot become your own person. You cannot become an individual. They do that psychologically by creating constant fear and chaos. So you never feel like you can do anything. And then they're going to do it through technology. And eventually the technology will have to enter into the human being, which is the ultimate possession. Anything entering from the outside is possession, by definition. So this is what we are up against. So we can't become ungrounded and have this escapist attitude because we're overwhelmed and we don't understand the task. And just say you're just gonna pull back and just watch everything go down. Right? So we also can't have this perfectionism. I see a lot of people with an incredible amount of perfectionism, like because an individual has made mistakes in their past that they're not capable of leadership, because certain people can't have a heroic quality to them because they don't have the same political ideas as you. We're becoming very perfectionist, and in that perfectionism, kind of inhuman, because God works through every single human being, no matter what you believe or where you size up next to someone else. God works through imperfect individuals. That is the reality. And so there is something really repulsive about this incredible perfectionist attitude that we have towards, governance, towards each other. That's really unhealthy because it's not allowing God to appear in yourself. If we're super judgmental of every single person we see and every event that we, look at, then that's saying that there's a sickness inside of ourselves, or there's a perfectionism inside of ourselves. We don't need perfectionism. We need good. We need goodness. We don't need perfectionism to solve corruption. Perfectionism never solves corruption. It never solves evil. It only perpetuates it, because perfectionism is to have a perfect person is impossible. And so a lot of people are waking up and they're so disgusted at how corrupt it is that they're just at a point of being black-pilled, and they're not wanting to have any small victories or any small wins, or they don't understand that every single transformation, every single return to order has been a series of very, very, very small wins by very imperfect people. Everything great, really, in the culture was put forth by somebody who is imperfect, sometimes very imperfect. So this judgmentalness in our time of crisis is really not helping us either. God works in every person, no matter, what their family is or their political ideology. Right? And you have to understand that, because you have to see God as working in you. And if you look out there and you have this, list that people have to have in order for you to accept them or whatever, that's also what you're doing to yourself. And that's a very uncomfortable place to be in. So to conclude, we can't have this level of spiritual escapism where we're just thinking that we're going to meditate and observe what goes down. We can't affect it. We can't control it. Because if you really understand where we are on a spiritual level as what is our task in this epoch, it is to confront evil and develop a society that is based in freedom through establishing the right covenants and laws around that to protect the innocent. That is our spiritual task. It's not in just our individual development at this point. It is in creating a culture and a society of freedom so that spirituality can blossom in every single human being and every person can individuate. Because if you cannot individuate, if you cannot become an individual, you cannot truly know Christ. You cannot truly evolve further in your development. So we must create in our culture, in our society, a society of freedom. And we must do our best to institutionalize that through sustaining any laws that represent divine law. And yes, the people will be imperfect, and everybody is imperfect, and nobody will embody these things perfectly, and that's not the point. The point is not to have a bunch of perfect superhero leaders come in and save the day. The point is to have a sober, methodical approach and accept and celebrate small wins in the right direction, and really, really fight for that, because that's what's going to do the trick. Now, the other kind of escapism that happens that will also not solve the problem of this dark group in society is material escapism. I see so many people who are just not thinking big enough. They're not precise enough. And they just think that this is a geopolitical issue, that the world will be solved through, like certain financial decisions, or by introducing, like I hear more and more times now, if we just introduce the breakthrough technology, suddenly we'll be in this kind of utopia. No. The reason why the world is disrupted isn't because actually of resources at all, though obviously having resources can help to a degree. The real reason is because of spiritual disorder. We have a spiritual problem. We are unrealized. Okay, we have to understand Christ. We have to understand God, and that is the only realization that will solve anything. So we have to place the geopolitical, the material, in its rightful place. It's not going to solve anything. It's not going to solve a spiritual problem, and it certainly isn't going to address if there is a cult order that is operating outside of our definitions, a group of probably less than 100 people that uses nations as arms of its own hydra and is manipulating the world through this consolidated power and now technology. So you're not going to get to the root if you think that the issue is just some material thing. It will just be like that game at the carnival where another one pops up and another one pops up until we've literally fought each other so much there's nothing left and we're exhausted and we're in a pod somewhere eating slop and bugs with our virtual glasses on. Because what happens is they work intergenerationally. They get the younger generations more and more accustomed to a chaotic and unnatural life. And then the older generations die off. And so if we don't institutionalize, or if we don't pass the proper legislation that is oriented around freedom and cutting the technologies back and having a real spiritual education, then there's a defined degeneration of the culture by generation, right? And this is what we're already seeing with little kids that can't, they can't put the iPad down. They can't make eye contact. They're having social problems. They don't have the skill set and the kind of capacities for empathy and things like that the older generations did. Some of them, not all kids, but we are seeing different ways in which the younger generations operate based on what they have been exposed to, which is our fault. So we have to remedy that. We have to take responsibility for that. And we can. It is not too late. So you can't blame a religion. You can't blame a nation. You can't blame a people. You have to go to the root. And then you can say, this is the foundation of this country, which is based around freedom and certain protections around basic morality. And then you can work through that framework. Again, there should be no foreign nation. I don't care if it's Israel. I don't care if it's China. I don't care if it's Timbuktu. There shouldn't be any nations that have this lockdown of Congress or this lockdown on, owning all of the land and the farmland. There shouldn't be any monopolies, right, in America by any foreign nation or any company. It is un-American, and it's been happening through dishonesty and loopholes. All of that needs to be addressed. All of that needs to be addressed just based on the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, based on our own standards. That needs to be addressed. But what's going on in the greater scheme of things is an occult spiritual level, and you cannot say that the entire occult spiritual level of this is Israel. Right? It is beyond Israel. It is beyond the Jewish people. It is beyond China. It is beyond the Chinese people. It is not about any peoples. It is not about any country. It is a group that is beyond those things, that uses the different countries in the world like a chessboard, and we are the pawns to consolidate more and more power and then put in a technological system of control, in which it's already been doing a very good job of that, and America is going to be the last stand. Okay, so again, one more time, this is not me saying that any nations that are forcing themselves on America, getting themselves in with disgusting relationships with politicians, blackmailing politicians, that's wrong. But we have to look even deeper than that to be precise and be accurate. It's actually would be better to say different coalitions of intelligence agencies. But it is not one nation, it's not one people. So when individuals keep going on and on about that, it's like, are you just trying to get people focused on one nation, one group, to hide the reality that the real problem is beyond one group or one nation? Is that an operation in itself, consciously or unconsciously, to stop the spiritual level of this and the real physical reality that this group exists and uses us, right? So we need both. We need the spiritual level of understanding, but we also need the right geopolitical movements, the right laws, the right legislation in order to create the container so the spiritual can grow. This is what we need. It needs to be a two-step approach. And too many people are materialists. They are hardcore materialists. They don't even think they have a soul. They're not even sure if a spiritual world exists. And that is a problem when dealing with this particular situation, because a materialist is not qualified to diagnose what is going on because they don't understand occultism, because they don't even think the realm of occultism is real. So you're not going to find a solution to why all of these events are happening. And it is generational. Like this group has been operating for a very long time, right? You're not going to stop it by blaming it on one country or another. So materialists are not qualified to diagnose this or to really understand how to solve it, because they're not operating in the realm in which the root of it operates. And again, a lot of this also just is possession. It is spiritual possession. And certain families that have become extremely spiritually possessed, And if we understand that, we can confront it. If we think that it's just going to be whack-a-mole, if we don't, we'll just get torn into, a war in the Middle East soon, a war in Eastern Europe. It'll just be one thing after another. It'll be more political assassinations in different places all over the world because we're not getting to the root of it. We're just collapsing the game board of these different pieces to consolidate power essentially for that group, right? And of course they use, natural conflicts between different cultures and the rage and ancestral wounds so that they can continue to do everything they're doing while we blame each other. That is the strategy, that is the technique, and that needs to stop. If we want to solve this, we actually need to come together. If we have differences, which we do, and wounds that need to be healed, which we do, let's do that. But let's do that on our own terms, not because some dark occult group is picking us against each other, right, and benefiting from it. We can solve our problems between left and right on our own terms. We can solve our problems between, different cultural groups on our own terms, with Christ at the center, with God at the center if you're not Christian. We can place God at the center of our conversations, and we can heal anything, or at least get on the journey to that. But that's not what we're seeing. We're seeing a world that is getting darker and darker and darker because this is the signature of black magic groups which feed on this, which love this. We can heal. We can come together. We absolutely can confront this, especially this early. But we've just got to understand what's going on and who is really in charge and where all the pieces are falling. So let's close out this episode by saying it is not precise enough to say, oh, this is Israel. This is a transgender person that killed Kirk, or the real problem is transgender gangs on Discord, or this is a MAGA person. This is a problem with the far right. The actual people in power, which again is probably less than 100, use these movements, they use nations as pawns. And if Israel falls because of the heavy scrutiny that Israel is under now, this group will just work through another country. It'll create conflict between us and China. There's all these military parades going on with China. Wow, what a shock. It's just lining up the next war. It's lining up the next person that we have to hate in an Orwellian way. Next, it'll be Russia. It'll be the fall of Eastern Europe if we're not careful. And every time we'll become more disenfranchised, more and more exhausted, more and more financially depleted. That said, any inappropriate influence from any country or group, any lobbying, any exploitation should be addressed. American sovereignty should be the utmost priority. The issue is that we cannot be so naive to think that this corruption isn't rooted beyond nation states. To confront the decline we are experiencing, we need a twofold approach. Solutions for the geopolitical material level, like lobbying and finances and all of that kind of stuff, the corruption going on, but also solutions for the spiritual level and understanding of the spiritual level. We cannot solve this without including the spiritual. To address the root, which is spiritual, we must understand our opponent well. They operate through chaos and divide and conquer, which is why the assassination has so many strings going nowhere. It's why there's all these different narratives, and suddenly these videos are released chaotically that we're now all supposed to analyze. And it just leaves you thinking like, wow, we have the most incompetent FBI, we have the most incompetent police force. Okay, no, there are absolutely people in this country who have more than the ability to solve the Kirk assassination. Okay, the talent is there, the ability is there. There is something at the very top, right, that is controlling all of this and creating chaos. They're martyring someone, and then they're creating chaos through that, which is what they do. And it creates hopelessness, it creates exasperation, it creates doubt in the system. This is what we can recognize. So it's not just to cover up that this was an elite assassination by this group. It is because it is a form of chaos magic. That is chaos magic by definition. You are experiencing in and taking part of a mass ritual set up by these people because that is part of their occult religion. It's been going on for a long time. In our modern times, the black magic that this order uses has evolved to operate through technology. It's not precise enough, it's not accurate enough to just say, oh, it's Kabbalah, or oh, it's paganism, right? That's not precise enough. It is a scientific knowledge of the demonic world that is beyond classical traditions. This scientific level of occult practice culminates to technology, the development of certain technologies and the use of technologies for black magic, for thinning the veil, for massive amounts of electricity and magnetism and nuclear reactions, which are part of modern occultism. We don't talk about it because prior to, the turn of the century, we did not have the ability to create nuclear reactions, to have super technologies with massive amounts of electricity and magnetism going on. We didn't have the ability to create that. We only start getting into that with Tesla around that time. So it wasn't included in the lexicon of black magic prior to that. But as soon as that stuff started happening, you have this one group start orienting themselves completely around, like very much the secret societies behind what was rising up as the Third Reich. All of these technologies, right? They start working through them. This is modern black magic. People are still thinking about like a magician with like a staff or some disgruntled high school student that is interested in like black magic or something. We are looking at an organized group of occultists that have evolved black magic to such a prolific point to have it include technology, and technology is now key in their rituals. Why do you think there is a statue of Shiva the Destroyer outside of CERN? Why do you think NASA was started by Jack Parsons? Why do you think that there's a constant insertion of psionics and interdimensionals, which are spiritual beings and spiritual abilities, into the disclosure scene? Why does the disclosure scene always mix spirituality and technology? Why? Why do people fear the alien religion? Because this is their religion. Their religion is technology. Technology is the means in which they communicate with spirit. They use it to thin the veil. Why? Because they cannot produce through their own body any spiritual activity because they are not with Christ. They do not have the Christ acknowledged within them, so they have no real spiritual sight from within or any real spiritual abilities to do anything. So they have gone the other way. But that leads to externalism and materialism, rather than inwardness and transformation. This is what we are looking at. This is why we see, Lockheed Martin Skunk Works releasing a couple days after Charlie Kirk's assassination. They're like, oh, we have this big announcement to make. I'm sure you do. Because for these occultists, technology and the eclipse, right? Technology and death go hand in hand. This is the level that we need to be operating at to understand what is going on and to not be duped. We do not live in the days of a dark Merlin walking around abracadabra. Okay, we live in a time where it's happening through this huge push in technology, and that's why it is an affront to our sovereignty. That's why they're rushing it along in the big, beautiful bill. They wanted to create this moratorium where you couldn't legislate the development of AI or certain technologies. You couldn't tell them no, because they have to have a certain level of influence and power and control and surveillance by 2030. We see the moratorium and it's like, you can't criticize it until that time period. Then you have Klaus Schwab, the Internet of Bodies guy who wants everyone to be a cyborg in this postmodern future. He's also 2030. So they have to have this stuff in 5 years. Really, in about 8 years is really important, because there are certain spiritual forces that will begin to appear, and they have to have it prepared for that. Dark spiritual forces that will begin to appear, and they are setting the stage for that. That's why it is a rush. That's why there's the chaos. That's why they have to roll all this stuff out, even though it's a little bit imperfect, because they are on a timeline, make no mistake. Like any kind of magical practice, it works through the celestial phases in which certain celestial gates open and certain celestial gates close. Certain entities are possible and visible at certain times, and they disappear. So they have to have things ready for when, their demonic presences come about, which is going to be by 2030. They've already said that. And technology is a huge piece in it. So you're not just dealing with, there's a level of technology, sure. It's convenient, I'm using it now, great. I'm for the moral development of advanced technology. I'm not for no technology, as I've said many different times. But we cannot address this level of spiritual warfare with an understanding of occult rites from the 1700s. Our knowledge of science, of the spiritual realm and the beings, is required to confront what we're facing. So we have to have a spiritual scientific knowledge within ourselves, which includes Christ. This is not New Age. This is not, some kind of weird thing. I'm including, we can have a scientific knowledge of who the Christ is. We can know exactly. Of course we can. How could any being that is God incarnate, how could we not know that to every fine detail? Why would we avoid that? Why would we hide from that knowledge? And of course we can get that because it is within us. We have everything around us to steward that and experience that and bring that about, and that is actually our task as well. And that is the exact knowledge and process that will put an end to this evil that has that level of understanding about the demonic plane, right? When it comes to the establishment of a right and moral society, we must be realistic, steadfast, and united. Realistic, steadfast, and united. It will require courageous and selfless people to provide the leadership and, unfortunately, oftentimes absorb the ignorance of the masses. It takes very special people to rise in times like this. You have to have a special quality about you, because oftentimes, as I said, especially the thing about perfectionism and how upset people are, a lot of people don't want to bear the brunt of that. So it will take a courageous and selfless people to provide leadership and, unfortunately, oftentimes absorb the ignorance of the masses and operate through that incredibly difficult position. Since this culture is controlled through intimidation and blackmail, that necessitates us to become compassionate and understand that no human being is perfect. In fact, God works through imperfect people because God is within all people, and all people at any point in time may turn to God and change. That's mercy. So may we have mercy on each other so that mercy may fall upon us as well. To judge another for their struggle and expect perfection is to work against the healing of this country. Perfectionism is not the answer to corruption. Instead, we must celebrate the smallest victories and cherish any acts of bravery. So if somebody does something in the right direction, we should be cheering that on. We should be celebrating that. That will amplify it. Any act of bravery, any act of courage in the right direction should be absolutely adored at this point. It shouldn't be, oh, that's not enough. Oh, we're going to fail or whatever. We have to have an attitude of gratitude towards the smallest of victories, towards any brave action. That's where we need to be. That will create more. These small wins are the only thing that has ever advanced a nation. We hear about these huge heroes that have saved people, created these wonderful movements, but actually it was a bunch of small events that led up to these great people. We have to keep that in mind. This isn't going to be solved by one election, by one great president. It's not going to be solved in 1 year. This is going to take decades for us to really get ourselves out of. We have to know that there's no magical presidency. There's no magical bill that will be passed. This is a tedious process of small wins and victories, and celebrating every act of courage, and knowing that over time we can fight back this illness that is within us, but also within the world. And the more that we are able to see it and confront it in the world, the more that we're able to see this evil in the world, this black magic in the world, the more we are able to heal it within ourselves. This is a very sacred process that's going on, and it is not overnight, because the reason why this is even going on, in part, is because we're not able to see the evil in ourselves. We're not sure what's moral and immoral. We're so distracted with the kids and the job and our own trauma and our own pain that we're not understanding the larger spiritual principles that are at play within ourselves and the world. Thus, we're not able to solve them when they come about. So this is very much an initiation for every single human being. So every big event, every time a corruption is solved, it is really the culmination of many flawed and often invisible efforts. So we have to understand that that's what we're going into, because I do think that we can have a naivety towards political change and getting our governance into a more aligned place. We think it's going to happen overnight. We don't have any tolerance for the reality that the bureaucracy is completely corrupt. We don't have a realistic attitude towards that. We need to have a much more compassionate and, I would say, grounded understanding on how things are going to be fixed, rather than constantly being set off by this perfectionist black pill attitude that is not going to provide the right forces spiritually to actually solve the problem, right? Because as soon as someone becomes too black-pilled, it's like, I personally immediately think that you don't understand evil. You don't understand how the world works, and you don't understand how things are solved, because we're exactly where we should be in regards to our spiritual development, and there is a path to get out of it. It's just not easy. So when I see people getting too black-pilled, it's like, do you know how humanity evolves? It is through exactly tough times like this, and it is through almost a tedious level of courage and small victories and small wins and invisible people who do incredible things that never get talked about. That's where we are with this. If we know that, we can have peace in that. There's no perfect hero that's going to come around and do everything right. It is a tedious fight for every small win. That's where we are. If we know that, we can prepare ourselves. If we know that, we can change that. Okay? We will heal and grow through patience and understanding that there is no fast path to victory, no perfect hero. Instead, there are many small wins that over time push back the darkness that threatens our way of life. But in this situation, every small victory is huge, because the darkness has ingrained itself so much that even then it is relative. There will not be one hero nor one heroic moment of restoration if you think that you will be disappointed. It will take all of us, and it will take many years. The discomfort we experience will be our greatest teacher. If we can accept that, we can win. This is a spiritual battle. That first begins in each one of us. If we can place the truths explored here rightly in our mind, we can overcome everything that confronts us. So the truth of it being a spiritual battle, we have to have the right knowledge and the right approach to confront that, and then taking care of any kind of material, geopolitical aspects in their own right. If we have a two-prong approach, we can solve this. If we only pay attention to one, we cannot. If you only think it's a spiritual battle and you don't have to do anything in the material world or participate in culture, that's not going to be enough. If you're a total materialist and you don't even care about the spiritual plane or to understand it, that's not enough. We have to do both, and that's why this is an initiatory period for humanity, because we're seeing what evil is. We're seeing what good is collectively in the world, not just in our personal life with a neighbor or a parent or something. We're actually looking at archetypal evil and archetypal good when society gets to this point. So we have to have the right approach, which includes a spiritual approach, spiritual knowledge, direct, and the material geopolitical. Neither one can be left if we want results. We can create communities and a culture that is attuned to spirit, that is healthy. But we have to walk through this period of darkness to get there. But we can do it together, and we have to come together. Okay? We have much more in common. I don't care what race you are. I don't care what religion you are. I don't care what country you are from. We have much more in common than we don't, than we lack. And right now we need to come together around the basics, just decency and freedom. And if we can do that, we can lessen the chaos. We can begin to cut it back and get the upper hand. But as long as we're fighting, as long as we're divided, as long as we hate each other, as long as it's, that's going on to this degree, we can't solve it. We have to begin to come together. And it doesn't mean that we agree on everything, but we have some really big things to fight for and to agree on for now, right? Which is ultimately our way of life is being threatened by evil. And I don't care who you are, what group you're from, we need to address that. And we need to do that together. And we can solve whatever political issues or cultural wounds, you know, along with that. Right. Okay, thank you guys so much for joining me. Next week, I will be discussing the eclipse and the significance of the eclipses in Black magic or just in spirituality, and also the coming dark days of the year. All right, you guys, thank you so much, and I'll see you in our next stream.